Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Finstep Asia Edge Podcast. We are back at the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority today, and we're going to be doing a podcast with Mr. Nicholas McNicholas, if I got the name right, Nick, and who is the Head of Regulatory Affairs and Enforcement at VARA. We'll run through a look at Nick's role, but also looking at how VARA has been enforcing different elements of their regulatory supervision and what are the things that the market needs to keep in mind for virtual assets activity in Dubai. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us today. Bright and sunny day as always in Dubai, and a busy packed week. We're recording this during one of the busy times for you, but we really appreciate you taking out time and joining me today.
Thanks, Musheer. Delighted to be here.
Nicholas, you've had such a rich experience in regulatory affairs, in enforcement, in financial services. Would love to get a bit of understanding about your background and your career, and then talk about your journey recently in VARA.
Sure. Thanks, Musheer. Delighted to share with you. It's interesting how I got here, because I didn't expect to end up in virtual assets supervision, but that's the beauty of being in financial services and being in regulation. You don't quite know what's around the corner. I've 20 plus years, 25 plus years in legal and financial services work. I most recently came from the European Central Bank, so maybe working backwards. So I joined the European Central Bank in February 2015.
Nice. Okay.
I was 3 months into banking supervision, being centralised in Europe, a very ambitious project. So I joined in February 2015. We were all new to Frankfurt. I joined the authorizations division, which is all about market entry, right? So
Correct.
it's the licensing, qualifying holdings, passporting, and in particular the fit and proper tests for all the directors and the key function holders across Europe. So I did that for the last 9 years. That gave me tremendous insights, particularly into board governance and how the boards of the banks work and what are the key risks for banks in Europe. And it broke down into so many different areas, like the diversity of the banking boards, having the requisite degrees of technical know-how on the boards now, and things like climate risk, but also IT risk. They also worked on the crypto assets the crypto assets licensing paper, setting out the ECB's approach to the risks that it perceived with crypto assets. And prior to that, then, I'd been at the Central Bank of Ireland. I was a senior enforcement lawyer. I joined the Central Bank of Ireland in 2010, and I came in again to a kind of a new era of supervision in Ireland. It was 2010, just after the financial crisis. We had a new suite of powers open to us to investigate banks and other financial service providers, and in particular, I helped set up the fit and proper investigations for the financial services providers and the ecosystem around that. So governance had been seen as one of the key risks following the banking crisis, and so the 2010 Act in Ireland and other countries was designed to really focus in on governance, and good governance being one of the key things for good compliance. Prior to that, I was actually a barrister, so I started my life as a barrister.
Sure.
Firstly in London, I was a member of Lamb Chambers. I'm still a door tenant there. I started off life as a criminal barrister, then kind of branched into civil law, and ended up qualifying as a tax consultant. And so part of my practice was in forensics and tax consultancy and law, but that's over 15 years ago now. I mean, it's still recent, but it's being replaced by the in-house experience, if you like. And so I came to VARA I was working with the ECB until the end of last year.
And I think you've had such a wide career in the sense across from criminal to forensics, tax. Then you've looked at governance and working with the central bank. In both places, in the regional as well as in Ireland. I think that makes a very rich experience as you're coming in here. What attracted you to the VARA role, as it were, and if you could understand a little bit more about your key focus areas at VARA.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk about that. I think, first of all, on a personal level, when I came down to meet the guys here at VARA, they were very dynamic, friendly, open, and excited, and the excitement was palpable. And I had, in a sense, in all my stages, being in a kind of a startup situation. So Central Bank of Ireland, obviously very established regulator,
Sure.
but we were dealing with the new fit and proper regime and a new host of powers. And so we had to kind of design it on the whiteboard and work forward from that. Same with the ECB. When we arrived in Frankfurt in 2015 and we had CRD4, the Capital Requirements Directive, and all the different member states having implemented it slightly differently, and we had to bring everything together, design things from the ground up, and there was an electrifying atmosphere there. Really enjoyed those initial years at the ECB, and so this was a bit the same. We were in a very new space. VARA was a newly created regulator. It was in an area that clearly is moving at an incredible pace, and it was in Dubai, where really you can see the impetus of attracting new tech business, Web3. You look around this week is Binance Blockchain Week. A couple of weeks ago was GITEX. There's always some sort of fintech or legal or virtual assets conference being organised here. So a lot of the global players are coming here, and it's a great place to kind of to develop that. So virtual assets had been something that I had some knowledge of, but clearly not a very deep knowledge of. And so coming into this space offered me the opportunity to really learn about this area and apply what I would call the traditional principles to a new area. And,
Sure.
The key risk areas and the key compliance areas are still there, and then it's just about working out the detail of the business models of the things that are being proposed and working out how they all stitch together. So I think that it was really the chance at doing something new, learning something different. I also liked the fact that VARA is a very agile regulator.
Correct.
Things can get done quickly. So enforcement can get done quickly. If we need to adapt or change our regulatory framework to suit what's coming in, we can also do that relatively quickly. So we have a robust and certain framework, but it
Sure.
also has the ability to be malleable, to be flexible, to be adaptable.
Very true, and I think that's an important element as well. The two key things I take away from your interest. One is, a lot of times when we look at virtual assets, and quite a few times people are like, oh, this is a completely new world. But there's certain principles that have probably stayed throughout centuries in some terms, in terms of regulations and oversight and supervision. You spoke about governance as one of the key things that we were talking about. And when I started here, it was right at the time when FTX had collapsed, right? And it's a overwhelming conversation around governance, particularly there, right? So I think that having that foundation and the deep expertise you have in that is very, very appropriate for this market. And the second thing, as you said, being the first crypto regulator in the world, and the dynamic being agile is also very important given how fast the business models evolve here in virtual assets. And so from that perspective, when you're looking at, so I'm going to try to break it down in maybe two parts, right? You're looking at regulatory affairs, and you're also looking at enforcement in some senses. So maybe we can start about talking a little bit more on key focus areas from a regulatory affairs perspective for VARA and for yourself, and what does, for a broader audience who may not necessarily be as aware, what does regulatory affairs entail?
Sure, yeah. So under the remit of regulatory affairs comes, I would say, two main things. The first one is local and international cooperation with the other regulators. So there are, so VARA is indeed the first standalone, as I understand it, regulator totally dedicated towards virtual assets, but there are other established regulators around the world, clearly, that have robust frameworks. MiCAR in Europe, and all of the departments that deal with the crypto assets in Europe, housed under maybe the central banks or the conduct authorities, and also in the Eastern Belt in Asia with the Hong Kong and Singapore, and Central Asia we met with the Kazakhstan AFSA yesterday, and looking at other regions and other areas that are exploring this topic is what regulatory affairs is, I would say, predominantly dealing with. So we also have a very rich tapestry of regulation and local and federal laws and rules and bodies here in the UAE.
Correct.
So that in itself creates a very rich and colourful landscape of different regulators that we can cooperate with locally.
Yeah.
Obviously we have the Central Bank of the UAE as the primary regulator for financial institutions, and some of those LFIs may seek to operate in the VA space. Then you have the free zones, ADGM in Abu Dhabi and the DFSA here in Dubai, and all the associated commercial registries, all with their own frameworks. So understanding and cooperating with those is key. We have our delegated authority from the Securities and Commodities Authority. So clearly we have we signed an MOU with them not so long ago, and clearly we have a very close working relationship with them. So the ESCA are the regulator of the federal system, and VARA has the carve out for institutions, organisations, companies working in or from Dubai. So clearly we talk to each other a lot. Also in regulatory affairs, and this where it has a crossover with enforcement, I deal with the collaboration with the law enforcement agencies,
of course,
the FIU. Clearly money laundering is a concern in all financial institutions, and you might say even more so in virtual assets, and so that's a big focus that we have. So collaborating with those and the central bank indeed as part of the national anti-money laundering framework and committees. So that's a large part of what we do in regulatory affairs. There's also kind of a policy side, but then we have other people here in VARA specifically dealing with specific buckets of policies. So you might say a policy on tokenization, a policy on derivatives, a policy on this, and we've dedicated people working on that. I have a role as well in bringing a lot of that together, and harmonising the divisions within VARA, talking to each other. So we have our we have also in enforcement. Then maybe to talk a little bit about that, I think it's fairly obvious what enforcement is, what enforcement does. We've got quite wide enforcement powers under the regulations. So part of my role was continuing the enforcement that had been done, and developing it into a robust framework, a methodology which we're drafting and actually operating on the ground, and to ensure that we have a robust, credible enforcement policy, one that is effective and punishes bad behaviour, but more importantly deters bad behaviour in the future, with the view to ensuring compliance. We clearly work very closely with the supervision teams. We get referrals from enforcement from various different areas. One of our primary focuses at the moment is cracking down on unlicensed activity.
Sure.
So we want to make sure the ecosystem in Dubai is safe, secure, so that there are no unlicensed players out there offering virtual asset activities. And this also, of course, makes a level playing field for those who are actually abiding by the rules, coming in and getting licensed and being supervised by VARA. So cracking down on that is one of the key focus areas as we really ramp up our supervision. And of course, there are more licensed entities coming in all the time, right? So they then go into steady state supervision. Clearly, there will be referrals from supervision to enforcement. Obviously, in a perfect world, all compliance officers doing their jobs amazingly well. There shouldn't be too many, we hope. And I would say also one of my roles in enforcement is working with the licensing and supervision teams to ensure that the compliance officers in the VASPs know the importance of the rules, understand them, and hopefully comply with them. So, so we make our job easier in enforcement ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's a responsibility that's almost pre-licensing in the sense of from the time people apply. The governance structure, it kind of plays into how they build up on their license, and then through the license all the way to regular supervision. Just taking a slightly deeper dive into the enforcement piece, because we can also touch on the regulatory affairs a little later again, is for the audience and those who are looking at understanding, would you be able to say kind of the process that's typically followed, that the industry can understand for enforcement, the steps that VARA takes, and to make it robust, but also the engagement that exists with those who are being looked at?
I think that's a good question, and part of our role always is to reach out and be understandable and be transparent to the market, to consumers, to industries. So I think I'd answer that question first by starting by saying we can have cases referred to us in enforcement through many different channels. For example, it could be the person on the street just spotting illegal, sure, I call it illegal, but in breach of the regulations activities, reporting that to VARA. It could be a whistleblower working for one of the VASPs, or reporting on a breach. It could be coming from the sources that we have, other regulators, law enforcement authorities, or it could be coming from supervision. Whenever we find one of these breaches, the first thing that an enforcement lawyer expert would do is to see, does it breach any of our regulations? So we have our suite of regulations, our rule books, the federal laws governing money laundering, etc. All of those rules, we will do a thorough analysis to see if there is actually a breach of any of those. Now, there is a little bit of categorization here in terms of risk. Not every breach will automatically lead to an enforcement action.
Sure.
So you can have more minor breaches. I won't say what those might be, but it could be a delay in doing something which enforcement would not necessarily come in immediately. A lot of these things can also be dealt with by healthy supervisory dialogue, right, between the supervision teams and the VASPs, and this would be common practice in any regulator, that certain things can be dealt with by dialogue and remediation. Okay, enforcement tends to be a method of last resort, because, well, what does enforcement typically end up with? Well, it typically ends up with a fine and perhaps a daily penalty until something is done. So enforcement can do two things. It can punish for previously poor, bad behaviour by issuing a financial penalty. It can also try and encourage compliance, and so daily penalties until the firm becomes compliant, for example, could be a rule. There could be other methods like supervisory warnings, for example, which are quasi-enforcement letters that will go out to a firm noting that they've done something wrong, and essentially like a yellow card, and if it happens again, it might end up in fines. There can be, of course, more draconian types of enforcement measures, like stripping a firm of their license, or amending the conditions of their license, or revoking or suspending their license. It can also mean the removal of somebody from a board if somebody's no longer fit and proper. This was something that we did very intently with the banks in banking supervision. If members were no longer fit and proper, they'd be reassessed and potentially removed from the board of the bank. So again, you've come back to governance being a key thing indeed, and we can't underestimate the importance of good governance in these institutions, tone from the top, etc. So I think also I should mention that we, generally speaking, we infuse a certain amount of fair procedures also into our enforcement process. So it's not just like issuing parking tickets. We go out and slap a fine. There is a process by which we engage with the firm. We usually give them a space of time within which to make written representations. If we've got anything wrong, which is possible, then they have a chance to reply. We look at those, and then we'll only issue a final notice if we're satisfied that the breach has been done. And then after that, there's usually a period of appeal as well. There's a 30-day period to appeal to the grievance committee,
Sure.
who's at a higher level than VARA, and that can be heard then independently to see if the fine still sticks. And that's roughly, in a nutshell, our enforcement methodology.
No, it's very structured. It's also very engaging, as you mentioned, where there's an opportunity to represent yourselves and clarify if at all, right? The other question on this is, in the recent time, but broadly even in the last few decades, financial services regulators typically do work very closely with law enforcement and other local bodies, right? So what's the approach when you have something that may be a breach of VARA regulations and hence needs enforcement action, but also likely breaching other local law enforcement actions or other regulatory breaches, right? Because there are certain elements which may not be purely VARA regulatory elements itself. How are you?
Yeah.
I know you're working with a lot of the law enforcement, etc.
Sure.
So just getting a sense of how that collaboration is done
Yeah.
to move that forward.
Yeah, sure. Again, that's a nice question. I would start by saying digital assets is a global business, and it's borderless to a degree. And of course, we have the FATF rules monitoring what happens, e.g. the travel rule, knowing the originator and the beneficiary, and working out the who these people are to avoid financial crime, money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, all of these things. So these are key common global threats to the entire financial services industry, and in particular the VA services industry, one might say, although it's across all. It's across all. So we have a clear need and an obligation to share with those who are conducting investigations into this area. We have centralised bodies like the FIU,
Correct.
To whom most of the suspicious transactions and activities will be reported to. They also centralise to a degree what is happening with any particular law enforcement issue, whether it's abroad or whether it's here at home in the UAE. We also then will liaise closely with, in Dubai, the Dubai police, obviously as the LEA, and the prosecutor if that's needed. And again, we have an open sharing relationship with those entities. Generally speaking, we share when we can share. If it's sharing internationally, there are certain things that we need to have in place before we send information outside of the jurisdiction, right? I mean, they can either be governed by treaties or MOUs, but generally speaking, as long as we can ensure confidentiality and reciprocity in terms of sharing arrangements, we're able and willing to share. And I think we're committed to the fight on money laundering, but it's not just money laundering, right? It's scams, it's frauds, it's people being robbed of their assets. And we get a lot of these requests in. We treat them very carefully, and our first protocol would be to look at any MOUs we have. We also attend on a lot of these international committees and knowledge sharing fora. For example, we attended recently the Financial Crime Summit in Abu Dhabi, but there are other forums and working groups that we attend to make sure that we are there and up to date with the requirements and the sharing agreements that are in place.
Yeah, and that's an important element of being the local and international collaboration together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that kind of answers both of my other question that I had in terms of partnering with other local partners and international partners in terms of working together on the regulatory affairs side, right? The next element, we now have understood the process, we understand the governance, we understand the collaboration. What would be some of the key elements both the virtual asset service providers who are licensed under VARA or going through that process to hopefully get a license should keep in mind and stay focused to remain compliant? The context of this is often you have many small tech startups or who are looking to become regulated entities. Also, on the other hand, tech startups typically, there's a mix of trying to push innovation and cutting edge, while they do need to, in a regulated environment, stay compliant, right? So that balance sometimes slips, and so how can they keep that focus and that governance, as it were, in their day-to-day, and what would be your suggestion, recommendation for both the management but also the teams that work and build these companies?
You mentioned a couple of kind of key points there. One is size, the other is innovative, fast pace.
Correct,
the other is startup. All of those present challenges to these entities coming in to get licensed, and once they get licensed, making a success out of their business, right? Through all of the meetings and encounters I've been having, be it at general roundtables or conferences or with the VASPs, there is an amazing understanding of the importance of compliance, which I think is, I would say, newish, right? It didn't always exist in financial services, at least in my experience. The focus on compliance has been getting more and more in focus and more important. And it's just almost a known now with any company that compliance is the starting point. There are key risks right across the board that apply, whether it's virtual assets, whether it's traditional assets, and they have to be got right. And if you focus on those key risks, we mentioned a few of them, your governance structures, your financials, sticking to your business model, not going outside, having key screening for money laundering, those customer and consumer protection, right, and handling complaints.
Right. Yeah.
Those key things which are not VA specific. If they're there, that's really going an awful long way to getting where you need to get to. Some of these business models are very intricate in terms of the amount of parties and players that they use. Be they payment systems, clearing houses, banks, other financial institutions, and the tracing and the structure of the money flow is very, very difficult. This can create complexities, and sometimes there can be a weak link, and it's understanding the weak link, and that's where a good compliance officer and a good business model will come in, understanding where those weak links are and really covering it to the satisfaction of VARA, and not just coming in and saying we have a weak link here, we don't know what to do with it, really to have thought it through. Size is an issue, right? You mentioned size. If you have smaller institutions, it's harder for them to comply with these quite intense regulatory frameworks. I mean, there's a number of options there, of course, like outsourcing, getting compliance consultants in, coming to VARA and speaking to us. But at the same time, we can only show you the way, we can't hold your hand.
Course, yeah.
You have to be a grown-up entity and get the white paper in and have thought of your business model and the structure as well. We have pilots running, to explore how certain things actually working in practice. And I think our outreach and our education of the public, understanding the risks, talking about the risks, publishing the risks, going to roundtables, speaking at conferences, telling people, doing podcasts, telling people of the types of things that we see will help them. And we hope, ultimately, to get to a situation where these two key concepts of finance and technology are reasonably understandable both to the company, to us, and to the person using it would be the ultimate objective, because the more we understand, the more we can spot and see. But very often it's about explaining these terms in really clear terms. So have thought about your business plan, your acronyms, your abbreviations. Is it understandable to everybody, not even the experts in a particular area? Present that business plan, and then we also will be able to spot some of the weaknesses in that, and see are any of the core compliance areas is being breached. There was one other point, so it was size, you were talking, startups. So startups, you have to get young, energetic, vibrant guys coming in with wonderful creative business ideas, and of course oftentimes the compliance part, the brakes, would have got left behind. But actually I think we're seeing the opposite of that in many cases.
That's
so
good
compliance, but it's just to remind those startup, energetic, enthusiastic firms that you can't run without the compliance. It's just impossible, and it's been said so many times now. Otherwise, you'll fall flat in the face. And we don't want firms to do that. We want firms to be successful. We want them to come to Dubai, get licensed, and be successful here. You know yourself, you were here during the FTX saga. I can't imagine how that was when you were here. You were probably doing long hours, but we want to avoid situations like that because negativity in the market is making people suspicious where they don't need to be suspicious necessarily.
Correct. And I was just going to add to that in the sense, I guess it's a two-phase thing or a balance that startups or companies on the cutting edge of innovation need to remember is compliance is very important because A, it's not just for protecting consumers, which is very, very important. They're the end users. But as a business, if your customers are not protected, then it's not going to last too long, let's be honest, irrespective of how big you become. And secondly is protecting the businesses themselves, right? In a lot of cases, guardrails, compliance, governance makes sure that you can last a longer time. It may have a little impact on innovating at speed, but that's always going to be a conversation, and I feel VARA has always done that, as you mentioned, the roundtables and the discussion. If you have something very, very new, very, very innovative, very open to the dialogue from what I understand and what I experience as well. Right?
Exactly. I mean, it's the balance, right? Yeah. It's innovation, but not at the expense of compliance. Or you could say that exactly the other way around. It's compliance, but not necessarily at the expense of innovation either. We're trying to achieve that balance here.
Nicholas, this has been great. We've really a lot of learning for both for me, but also I'm sure for the audience. Any final thoughts as we come towards the end of this conversation? I'm sure we can have more in the future, but any final thoughts that you want to tell to the broader market, your perspective, or broadly from a VARA perspective?
Just to say, it would be interesting to do this chat again in 12 months and see how things change, because things are moving quickly here, and it's really great to be at the heart of it. And from my perspective, I just want to keep talking to as many people as possible, be that in the industry or in the regulatory sphere, in particular regulatory because of my role, comparing notes and seeing how we can do this together.
Perfect. Thank you once again for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've had a great time listening to this and learned a lot like I have. Stay tuned, subscribe to our channels to know more about the Web3 world and listen in from experts like Nicholas on virtual assets and fintech. Thank you.